Hello and welcome back to the channel. We talk horror here. If that's something you enjoy, please consider liking and subscribing. I'm not going to waste your time today. We're doing another 10 underrated modern horror films. Let's get into the list right away. Nightsiren is a movie I briefly touched on in my video where I ranked every horror film I saw in 2023. I only got around to it at the end of the year, after I had already made my hidden gem recommendations video for the year, so I'm including it here instead. I think this movie deserves the spotlight a little bit because I was quite affected by it. It's from the Czech Republic, and it's about this woman who returns to the place where she grew up after receiving a mysterious letter about an inheritance. By circumstances out of her control, she ends up staying in this village a little longer than she had planned, and that's really where the trouble begins. Because of the main character's backstory, which I won't get into, and the fact that the townsfolk are incredibly superstitious, allegations of witchcraft are brought forth. But don't get me wrong here. This is not a movie about witches. If you go into this expecting Suspiria, you'll be disappointed. This is more about paranoia, misogyny, and mass delusion. Every once in a while, the movie goes to some surreal places, or it at least dabbles in surreal imagery. But for most of it, it stays pretty grounded. There's something so depressingly realistic about the abuse and harassment some of the women in this village have to endure. They never linger on it or go out of their way to, show you something disturbing. In fact, the events here are shown to be completely ordinary, which makes it so much more terrifying. Not everyone in the village is like this, of course, but over time, the mass hysteria starts coming into play. At nearly 2 hours, this is definitely a slower burn, but I was a big fan of this movie. There's one omission made in the end of the movie that I'm not entirely sure how I feel about, but it's not a super big deal for me. It just kind of came across as a strange choice, but overall, as I said, I'm a huge fan of this movie. Dream Home is a 2010 slasher from Hong Kong, but feels like it should have come out of the new French extremity movement. The film is brutal in its depiction of violence, but if that's something you can handle, this is definitely a hidden gem. The killer in this film is actually the main character, which is kind of a neat concept for a slasher, I think. The setup here is pretty simple. This woman is denied a loan to purchase, her titular dream home, so to speak, and she hatches a plan to make the apartment prices in this building go down. And her plan involves a lot of murder. It's told in a non-chronological order, so as the movie progresses, we see more and more of this woman's backstory. And obviously, the thing she's doing here is incredibly appalling, especially since the violence is so graphic. But you also feel a little sorry for her, in a way. Josie Ho, who plays the lead here, does a lot of the heavy lifting because her character shouldn't be sympathetic at all, but they somehow managed to pull it off. I also think this movie maybe came out at the right time, just a couple of years after the 2008 housing crisis, and in that way, it feels a little smarter than a lot of other slashers. This is not a film that's afraid to get a little political, and I always think that's really cool. Sleep Tight is a Spanish home invasion film told through the perspective of the home invader. The director of this film also directed Venus, which came out last year, and I've talked about that one quite a bit. I really like that one. So I thought it was only fitting that I talk about Sleep Tight as well. There's not a ton of graphic violence in this one, but it's still pretty disturbing because of how unsettling the main character is. He works through the reception at this apartment building for quote-unquote rich assholes, as he puts it. He despises these people, and there's really only one woman that he likes, but he likes her in this really weird way. He's grown very attached to her. He breaks into her apartment while she's sleeping every night, and he just kind of hangs out in there. Sometimes he gets into bed with her, other times he uses the shower. It's all quite upsetting, really. I've always found villains like this to be quite fascinating. The ones that will use violence if they have to, but much prefers to play mind games with their victims. He makes this woman's life a living hell, making sure she's knocked out with chloroform so she wakes up every morning with a headache, leaving things slightly out of place so she questions her sanity. This is a really well done film, but you're not going to come out of it feeling great. But if you like these types of really dark character studies, I think this is a must watch. As I'm sitting here editing the video, I realized that I forgot to bring up Door Lock, which is a South Korean remake of Sleep Tight. But they sort of changed it a little bit in Door Lock, and it's from the perspective of the victim, which, look, I'm glad that they changed it so it's not exactly the same story, but they sort of took away what made Sleep Tight unique. So I would definitely recommend Sleep Tight first. I think that's a way better film. But Door Lock is alright too, if you want to check that one out. Speaking of character studies, let's talk about Swallow. I've seen a lot of people categorize this as a drama, and I certainly understand that, but it has some pretty gnarly body horror in it, so I think it counts for the list. Haley Bennett stars as Hunter. She's the wife of this really wealthy businessman who's set to become even wealthier due to him taking over his father's position as CEO at a successful company located in New York. They are one of those couples who seem like they have it all from the outside looking in, but in reality, Hunter is stuck inside a very emotionally abusive relationship where she has been stripped of every little bit of her personality and identity. Her husband clearly just wants her to shut up and play the role of the trophy wife. To cope with this, she begins to self-harm. She starts consuming inedible objects, which makes for some truly horrifying scenes to watch. I know the premise sounds a little out there, but this is a real condition, and it's handled with care here. They do a good job of using the language of film to put us in the mind of Hunter. It'll cut from her looking at one of these objects to herself, and then back to the object, and I found myself thinking, that does look kind of tasty. And then you'll see someone actually eating food, and it'll look like the most disgusting thing you've ever seen. I also like that this is ultimately a story about someone trying to take control over their own life again. So even if you can't relate to her illness, you've probably felt that feeling of just life, getting away from you. Whether that be because of a bad relationship, a dead-end job, or if you're like me and just have struggled a lot with your mental health. There's lots more stuff here I think is interesting, but you should probably see it for yourself. The Woman is directed by Lucky McKee, who is best known for his early 2000s indie darling May. If you haven't seen that one, you should fix that immediately because it's great. After May, he did this movie called The Woods, which is kind of a riff on Suspiria, but then Bruce Campbell shows up and it turns more into an Evil Dead type of situation. It's not as good as May, but I think it's kind of interesting. I enjoyed The Woods as well. This is where I was going to pivot and talk about The Woman, but before I do that, I should probably mention that this is the second movie in a trilogy. Pollyanna McIntosh has played this character, the woman, in two other films that I won't cover right now, but I wanted to mention the first film, Offspring. It's a low-budget Jack Ketchum adaptation, which has an amazing premise, but ultimately isn't a great film. It's essentially The Hills Have Eyes, but set in a suburb, so there's this group of murderous cannibals, and the woman is part of that group, and they sort of invade this suburb. It's a very low-budget film, and it wasn't received with a ton of praise, so it's kind of weird that it's managed to spawn a whole entire franchise, but I'm glad it did. The Woman basically works like a spin-off to Offspring, as the only returning character is Pollyanna McIntosh's titular cannibal. Hunter discovers her alone in the woods and takes her back to his farm where he lives with his family. Bear in mind that she's this feral cannibal who doesn't speak English and has lived in the wild her entire life, so he takes her against her will, and the majority of the movie is her being held hostage at this farmhouse. It gets pretty fucking dark right away and stays that way for the entire movie because the father of this family, he says he's taking her in to civilize her, but that's clearly not what he's doing. He has a woman tied up in his farmhouse. Like, there's nothing good is happening here. Pollyanna McIntosh is the star of the show here, since she doesn't really have any dialogue, but she still manages to convey the woman's emotions perfectly. There's so much interesting dynamics happening here, with the family especially. It's very much the father who's, running the show. And over time, you start to see the gears turn a little bit, especially for the wife and the daughter, as they understand sort of what he's doing to this woman. A couple of years later, Pollyanna McIntosh directed a follow-up to this movie called Darlin, which I didn't like as much as The Woman, but I thought it had some neat ideas. But honestly, the ending of The Woman gets pretty fucking crazy, so that one was probably really hard to follow up, at least for me. Still, if you end up watching The Woman and liking it, I would also recommend Darlin. Lords of Chaos is one of those films I feel like I have to warn people about. I talk a lot about movies with disturbing content, graphic violence and stuff like that, but this one is actually based on a true story. There are some very graphic scenes of self-harm and murder that can feel a little exploitative depending on how you look at it. I'm honestly still not sure how I feel about that aspect of the film, but I do know that this is very well made. I like this movie quite a bit. The film is based on a book with the same name, and it's about the early years of Norwegian black metal band Mayhem. Have you ever heard people reference how Norwegian metal bands burn churches and kill each other? This is that story. I have not read the book that it's based on, but the movie sort of simplifies the story and really focuses on only a couple of characters that were all in the band Mayhem. There were, of course, other bands around that same scene at that same time, but that's not really the focus of the film. The focus here lies on the characters, and I think that's a very smart choice, because the people in the story were so young when all this happened. It's really fascinating from a psychological perspective. The only weird thing about the movie is that it's set in Norway, but everyone speaks English, and that's one of those things that annoyed me for a couple of minutes, but then I got over it. You should definitely stay away from this if you're not interested in true crime at all, but for everyone else, I think this is a very, very good dark drama with horror elements. Let's lighten the mood a little with Severance, a 2006 horror comedy from Christopher Smith, who later went on to direct Triangle, which is a pretty beloved genre-bending slasher film. Severance is my favorite film of his, though, because it's just so much fun. It's like a workplace comedy, think The Office, mixed with backwoods horror, like Wrong Turn. There's also some slasher elements in here. But just because it's a comedy doesn't mean it skimps out on the violence, and that's what I think is so cool and unique about it. The death scenes go hard in this movie, and not in a slapstick type of way that, a lot of horror comedies do it. These horror scenes feel proper, with a lack of a better word. It's about a group of salespeople that work for a weapons manufacturers, and they're on this team-building exercise in Eastern Europe. They're supposed to stay in this nice cabin in the middle of nowhere, but when they get there, it is completely run down, and of course, someone is stalking their every move. There's a lot of fun banter between the group, and even though the violence here is pretty gnarly, the humor is actually quite goofy and whimsical. Over the years, this has been a comfort movie of mine, not unlike Edgar Wright's Cornetto trilogy. Out of every movie I will recommend on these lists, this is probably the one I have rewatched the most. VFW takes a lot of inspiration from a bunch of John Carpenter's films, really, but mainly Assault on Precinct 13 and Prince of Darkness. It's an action horror hybrid with a ton of style to it. It's about this group of veterans who are in a bar fighting off a group of what I can only describe as drug-fueled crazy people. Basically, this is a siege movie. It's not trying to be anything more than that, and I'm very thankful for that. I love these types of films. As long as YouTube allows me to show the trailer for you guys and not just images, I think you're going to understand very quickly if this movie is going to be for you or not. Does this style seem appealing to you? If so, you'll probably have a great time. If the trailer does nothing for you, you can probably skip it. I am always intrigued by these really gory action films with horror elements. Also, the movie stars a bunch of veteran horror actors, including Stephen Lang, Fred Williamson, so, I mean, that's really fun as well. The director behind this movie has made some other films with a similar aesthetic, and I think it's a really good vibe. There's something kind of punk rock about it, if that makes sense. I've previously talked about Christmas Bloody Christmas, which is a Christmas slasher film, and I think that one's really fun as well. But yeah, definitely check out VFW if you want a modern riff on Assault on Precinct 13. Berlin Syndrome is about an Australian woman on holiday in Berlin who literally gets trapped in an abusive relationship. She meets this guy, and one morning after waking up in his apartment, she realizes that there is physically no way for her to get out of this apartment, and he's nowhere to be found. It's a very simple premise, but terrifying because it's done so frustratingly well. And what I mean by that is that the character here, like the main character, is actually really smart. She tries to get out as hard as she possibly can, but even so, the majority of the movie is her stuck in this one apartment. I think it's a very smart physical representation of how a lot of people feel in abusive relationships. I also like it because, when you have a smart main character like this, it means that you as the audience aren't constantly yelling at the screen. I feel like a lot of these types of movies only work because the characters are either really dumb or they just have the worst luck in the entire world. But Berlin Syndrome doesn't feel like that. It's refreshing. It's smart. Another thing I wanted to highlight is how disorienting the film can be sometimes from an editing perspective, and it's done like that on purpose. It's not to the point where it's like hard to follow, but the movie really puts us in the woman's shoes, where after a while, she doesn't know how long she's been locked in there. And I think that stuff's kind of cool, I mentioned a similar thing with Swallow, where the filmmakers are using every tool available to them to put the audience in the mindset of a specific character. Lesson of the Evil is directed by Takashi Miike, who you will know as the director of films like Audition, E.T. the Killer, and 13 Assassins. But the man has an extensive filmography, and it would not surprise me if his name shows up again in this series. This movie is essentially American Psycho if Patrick Bateman was a high school teacher. There are also some parallels here you can draw to Battle Royale. With those comparisons, I think you have a pretty good idea of what the film is, and what makes it so crazy and taboo to Western audiences. The film is a little over 2 hours long, and it has a pretty explosive third act. But before you get to that point, it's a really unsettling portrait of a serial killer. The movie has a lot of dark humor to it, which it probably needed because otherwise this was going to be like one of the most depressing movies ever made. This is a really strange one. It takes a long time to work up to its climax. You can see the serial killer's perfect facade slowly crumple throughout the film, which of course makes him feel more paranoid and desperate. Then you also see these high schoolers living their normal teenage lives, and ultimately none of that stuff really matters in the grand scheme of things, but I'm glad it's there. I'm glad the movie actually takes time to build out these characters, and in a shorter movie they probably would have just been, minor characters, but here we actually get time to know them. Obviously the fact that there's this serial killer perfectly hiding in this high school where, he has a homeroom for a bunch of teenagers. That's terrifying enough, but once you actually get to know the students, you really fear for them. And then when the movie goes in this absolutely bonkers direction at the end and all hell breaks loose, I mean, there's something darkly comedic about it, but it's also so incredibly hopeless. I don't know. I haven't been able to get this movie out of my head. And I think it's worth checking out if you want to watch something that's a little more on the extreme side, but also has some humor to it. And that's it from me today. I want to thank everyone for watching. Stay tuned. There are more videos coming. I've watched so many movies of a very specific variety that I'm going to talk about pretty soon here. one of the videos is not going to be like a list thing. It's more going to be like a critique. And then I have a tier list coming up that I want to do, and that's unscripted, and it's a kind of a different format, but I want to try doing one of those. So that's sort of what I've got coming up. I'm of course going to continue with this series. I just need to watch more movies. Need to figure out what else I can recommend to you guys. So part 3 of this series is probably going to take a little bit longer. I've got some other stuff kind of in the pipeline, but yeah, I'm of course working on all that stuff. And thanks everyone for taking the time to comment, recommending the channel to people. We've been growing this channel. It's really quite amazing, and I'm really thankful for it. Comment down below if there's any movie you think I should see. I got some recommendations on the last video I made, and I'm still working my way through those. Yeah, so definitely, if you think there's something that should be included in one of these, underrated modern horror films videos, please tell me, because that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this. I'm always on the hunt for more horror movies to watch. All right, with that being said, I hope you have a nice day, evening, whenever you're watching this, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Okay, bye.